It was the kind of morning where nothing seemed out of place. The rooster crowed at dawn, the smell of freshly baked bread wafted through the air, and the sunlight painted golden streaks across our modest yard. Life on the farm was routine, predictable in the way you'd expect when every day begins with milking cows and ends with aching feet. I was heading back from the barn when I noticed it. A small brown package, neatly tied with string, sticking out of our mail slot. Our mailbox didn't get much use apart from the occasional letter from the town council or some seed catalog Jennifer liked to browse. But this package? This was different. For starters, we weren't expecting anything. Jennifer hadn't mentioned ordering seeds or supplies, and I hadn't written to any of the traveling merchants we sometimes dealt with. Curious, I brushed off my hands and pulled it out. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, wrapped so tightly it looked professional. The name on the label stopped me cold. To Jennifer. Nothing else. No return address, no indication of who had sent it. Just her name, written in bold, confident letters. I turned it over a few times, frowning. Jennifer and I had been married for over a decade, and never once had she received a package like this. My gut told me to open it right there, but I hesitated. What if it was a surprise for me or the kids? Something innocent, like a birthday gift she'd hidden away and forgotten to mention? The barn chores could wait. I carried the package inside, placing it on the kitchen table where Jennifer was kneading dough. "Morning, love," she said without looking up. Her hands worked the dough with practiced ease, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. "Morning," I replied, setting the package down in front of her. "This came for you." Her hands froze mid-knead. For a split second, she didn't move. Then she wiped her hands on her apron and looked at the package like it was some kind of puzzle she didn't want to solve. "What's this?" she asked, feigning ignorance, though her voice wavered slightly. "That's what I was hoping you'd tell me," I said, crossing my arms. She glanced up at me with a nervous smile. "Probably just something I ordered from the merchant. Flour or something." "Flour doesn't come with your name scribbled on it like a love note," I said. My tone was light, but inside, something felt off. Jennifer grabbed the package and turned her back to me, walking toward the pantry. "I'll look at it later," she said quickly. I didn't argue, but I didn't move either. She tucked the package onto a shelf, closed the pantry door, and went back to her dough like nothing had happened. But I wasn't convinced. Jennifer wasn't usually secretive. If anything, she was the most straightforward person I knew. If there was nothing to hide, why shove the package into the pantry instead of opening it in front of me? Later that afternoon, while Jennifer was out feeding the chickens, I found myself standing in front of the pantry. My eyes locked on that little brown package. I didn't want to be the kind of husband who snoops, but something about this felt wrong. The twine was tight, but it came undone with a pull. Inside, wrapped in layers of soft paper, was a delicate silver bracelet with small engraved charms, a heart, a flower, and a star. It was finely crafted, not the kind of thing we could afford on a farmer's income. Tucked beneath the bracelet was a note. I almost didn't want to read it, but my hands moved on their own. For Jennifer, the brightest star in my life. L. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Who the hell was L? I stood there in the dim light of the pantry, clutching the bracelet and the note, my thoughts racing faster than I could keep up. The charm of the morning was gone. My hands were trembling, though whether from anger or disbelief, I wasn't sure. I stared at the note again, as if looking longer would somehow make it explain itself. For Jennifer, the brightest star in my life. L. The letters mocked me with their simplicity. My first instinct was denial. Maybe it was a mistake, a mix-up at the courier's. Maybe L was some distant relative I'd forgotten about, sending a gift to rekindle family ties. But that kind of thinking didn't hold water, and deep down, I knew it. Jennifer was out in the yard, scattering grain for the chickens, the sun glinting off her hair as though nothing unusual was happening. She didn't look like someone who had secrets. But then again, I'd never thought she'd hide a package either. I needed answers, but I knew better than to storm out and demand them. A direct confrontation would give her the chance to spin a story. I needed the truth, not excuses. I carefully rewrapped the bracelet, tied the twine back as tightly as I could, and returned the package to its spot in the pantry. It sat there innocently, as though it hadn't just turned my entire morning into a puzzle I didn't want to solve. When Jennifer came back inside, I was at the kitchen table with a mug of tea, trying to look as casual as possible. She wiped her hands on her apron and glanced at me. "You've been quiet," she said. "Just thinking," I replied, keeping my voice even. "Anything exciting in that package you got?" She froze for a fraction of a second before heading to the sink. "I told you, probably just some kitchen supplies. Haven't had the time to open it yet." I watched her carefully, looking for any tell, but she kept her back to me. The ease with which she lied sent a chill down my spine. "That's funny," I said slowly. "I thought you might have ordered more feed for the chickens or maybe something for the kids. But kitchen supplies? That's new." She shrugged. "Maybe I forgot. It's been busy lately, you know." Her voice was too casual, too rehearsed. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to nod, pretending to accept her explanation. The rest of the day passed slowly, the weight of the package pressing down on me with every passing moment. Jennifer went about her usual tasks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was avoiding me. She lingered in the barn longer than usual, took her time fetching water from the well, and kept busy with anything that didn't require being near me. By evening, I decided I couldn't keep the knot in my stomach any longer. I needed to know who Elle was, and there was only one person I could think of who might help, my neighbor and closest friend, Thomas. Thomas had been my friend since childhood, and if there was anyone in the village who knew about people's comings and goings, it was him. He ran the mill on the edge of town, a place where gossip was exchanged as freely as grain. I waited until after dinner, then told Jennifer I was heading out to check on some tools Thomas had borrowed. She barely looked up from her knitting, just nodded and murmured something about not being too long. When I arrived at the mill, Thomas was just finishing up his work for the day. He was a broad-shouldered man with a steady demeanor, the kind of person who could keep a secret when it mattered but wasn't above sharing information if pressed. "Evening, Robert," he said, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Didn't expect to see you so late." "Needed a word," I said, keeping my voice low. Thomas raised an eyebrow but gestured for me to follow him inside. Once the door was shut, I didn't waste time. "Have you heard of anyone around here, anyone in the village or passing through going by the name of Elle?" Thomas leaned against his workbench, frowning. "Elle? Can't say I have. What's this about?" I hesitated, debating how much to share, but I couldn't afford to hold back. "Jennifer got a package today. Inside was a bracelet, expensive looking, and a note. For Jennifer, the brightest star in my life. Elle." Thomas let out a low whistle. "That's bold. I need to know if she's been meeting anyone," I said. "If there's someone who's come into town recently, someone I've missed." He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Not much happens around here without me hearing about it. Only new face I can think of is that traveling troupe that came through a few weeks ago. They were here for the festival, remember? They had a musician, a juggler, and one of those, what do you call them, actors?" My stomach sank. "An actor?" "Yeah, a younger man. Fancy type. Called himself Lawrence something or other. Stayed at the inn for a week before moving on. I heard a few of the women in town talking about him, but I didn't think much of it." "Lawrence," I muttered, the pieces starting to fall into place. "You think he might be Elle?" Thomas shrugged. "Could be. But if he's sending gifts, it means he's still keeping in touch." My fists clenched at my sides. If he's what I think he is, then he's doing more than keeping in touch. I left the mill with more questions than answers. If this Lawrence was Elle, how long had he been involved with Jennifer? Had she met him during the festival, while I was busy with the children? I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning in circles. Jennifer's every move over the past few weeks seemed suspicious in hindsight. The extra trips to town. The way she'd been more distant lately, less affectionate. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to sit around waiting for answers to fall into my lap. It was time to confront Jennifer and find out what the hell was going on. The sun barely crept over the horizon when I rose from bed. Jennifer was still asleep. I stared at her, feeling a mix of anger and heartbreak. For years, this woman had been my partner, my best friend, the person I thought I knew better than anyone. Now, every glance at her felt like staring at a stranger. I made my decision quickly. If I waited too long, I'd second-guess myself. Quietly, I went to the pantry, retrieved the package, and carried it back to the kitchen. It was time to put an end to the guessing. Jennifer came into the kitchen an hour later, her hair tied back and her apron already on. She froze when she saw the package sitting on the table, unwrapped. The bracelet glinted in the sunlight, and the note lay next to it. Her face turned pale. "You want to tell me what this is?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Jennifer's hands shook as she pulled out a chair and sat down across from me. "Robert, I can explain." "Then start explaining," I said, crossing my arms. She stared at the bracelet like it was a coiled snake. It's not what you think." "What I think," I said, my voice tightening, "is that you've been hiding things from me. I found this package yesterday, Jennifer. And I know about the actor, Lawrence." "Is that him? Is he the one sending you gifts?" Her head shot up, her eyes wide with panic. "How do you know about Lawrence?" "That's not important. What matters is that you've been lying to me. So let's hear it. What's going on?" Jennifer let out a shaky breath and looked away. "It's complicated." "Uncomplicated," I said sharply. She flinched at my tone but didn't respond right away. I could see her debating whether to tell me the truth or spin another lie. "Fine," she said finally. "Lawrence is someone I met during the festival. He was charming. He paid me attention, said things I hadn't heard in years. He made me feel special." Her words hit me like a blow to the chest. "Special? You mean to tell me I haven't made you feel special? The roof over your head, the food on the table, the work I do every day to keep this family together, that doesn't count?" "It's not about that," she said quickly. "It's not about you. It's about me. I've been feeling lost, Robert. Like I don't even know who I am anymore. Lawrence, he noticed me. He listened." I slammed my hand on the table, and Jennifer jumped. "And what? That makes it okay? What else has he done, Jennifer? What else have you done?" Her face crumpled, and tears began to spill down her cheeks. "Nothing. I swear, nothing happened." "That's all?" I shot back. "Do you think I'm a fool? A man doesn't send a bracelet like this unless there's more to it. Did you write to him? Are you still in contact?" Jennifer shook her head, her tears falling faster now. "I didn't ask for any of this. He was just there. I didn't even open the package because I didn't want it. I didn't want to hurt you." "Well, congratulations," I said bitterly. "You've done a fine job of it anyway." The conversation was going nowhere. Every answer she gave felt like it was wrapped in half-truths. I couldn't trust her words anymore, and that realization gutted me. I stood and pushed back my chair. "You need to decide what you want, Jennifer. Because right now, I don't know if I can even look at you." She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "Robert, please. It's not what you think. I love you. I love our family." "Then prove it," I said coldly. "Because right now, all I see is someone who's been lying to me." I left the house, slamming the door behind me, and headed to the barn. The fields needed tending, but I couldn't focus on work. My thoughts kept circling back to her words, her tears, and the damn bracelet sitting on the table like a ticking bomb. By midday, I'd calmed down enough to think clearly. The only way to get to the bottom of this was to confront Lawrence himself. If he was still in contact with Jennifer, he'd respond to her. I went back to the house and found Jennifer in the kitchen, her eyes red and puffy. She looked up when I entered, and I could see the fear in her expression. "I need his address," I said flatly. "What?" "Lawrence. I want to know where he is." Jennifer hesitated. "I don't know. He said he was traveling with his troupe. I don't know where they are now." "Then find out," I said. "Write to him, send a message, I don't care how you do it. I want to hear what he has to say for himself." Jennifer opened her mouth to protest but stopped when she saw the look on my face. She nodded silently and went to fetch paper and a pen. The next few days were agony. Jennifer wrote the letter and sent it off through the local courier, but I had no idea how long it would take to reach Lawrence or if he would even respond. The tension in the house was unbearable. The children could sense something was wrong, though we tried to keep our arguments behind closed doors. At night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if my marriage was already over. Jennifer said she loved me, but her actions told a different story. And until I heard from Lawrence, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more she wasn't telling me. When the response finally came, it was worse than I could have imagined. The letter arrived a week later, addressed to Jennifer. I intercepted it before she could see it and opened it with trembling hands. "Dearest Jennifer," it began. I barely made it through the first paragraph before my blood ran cold. Lawrence wasn't just some passing flirtation. He was in love with her. He wrote about their time together like it was some grand romance, and he hinted at promises they'd made, promises Jennifer had sworn to me didn't exist. My hand shook as I finished the letter. Every word was a dagger, confirming my worst fears. Jennifer hadn't just been lying to me. She'd betrayed me. I walked back into the house, the letter clutched tightly in my hand. Jennifer looked up from her sewing, her face pale when she saw me. "What is it?" she asked nervously. I threw the letter onto the table in front of her. "Explain this." She picked up the letter and read it, her hands trembling as much as mine had. When she looked up at me, her face was white as a sheet. "Robert, I can." "Don't," I interrupted. "I've heard enough excuses. I want the truth. Now." Jennifer's voice broke as she tried to explain, but I didn't care anymore. Her lies had destroyed everything we'd built, and there was no coming back from this. I wasn't just angry, I was done. Jennifer stared at me across the kitchen table, clutching Lawrence's letter in her trembling hands. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but I wasn't moved. Not this time. Whatever I felt for her love, trust, respect had crumbled the moment I read that letter. Now there was only cold, calculated anger. "You still haven't answered me," I said, my voice sharp. "How long has this been going on?" She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Finally, she muttered, "It wasn't. It didn't mean anything." Asterisk didn't mean anything, asterisk, I snapped, my fist slamming down on the table. She flinched, but I didn't care. "That's your defense? A man's writing you love letters and sending you gifts, and you want me to believe it didn't mean anything?" Jennifer sobbed harder, her words coming out in fragments. I never. It wasn't physical. I swear. It was just words. I didn't think he'd take it this far." Her excuses only fueled my rage. I stood abruptly, grabbing the letter off the table. "You don't think this is far enough? What's next, Jennifer? What would have happened if I hadn't found that package? Or this letter? Were you planning to run off with him while I stayed here breaking my back for this family?" She didn't answer, just buried her face in her hands. I didn't bother waiting for her to regain composure. I had work to do. The first step in my plan was to isolate myself emotionally. I wouldn't let Jennifer's tears manipulate me anymore. She could cry, beg, and plead all she wanted, but I wasn't about to let her off the hook. The trust she'd destroyed couldn't be rebuilt, and I wasn't interested in pretending otherwise. I moved into the guest room that evening without a word. She tried to stop me, grabbing my arm and begging me to talk. I shook her off, packed my things, and closed the door in her face. From that moment, I treated her as nothing more than a stranger under my roof. The second step was control. Jennifer was about to learn that actions have consequences. I started by locking her out of the family finances. Our bank account was in both our names, but the reality was that I'd always managed the money. Jennifer never questioned it, and she had no idea how to access most of our savings without me. That ignorance became my weapon. I withdrew a sizable portion of the money into a separate account under my name, leaving just enough for household expenses to avoid suspicion. Next, I changed the password to the lockbox where we kept important documents, birth certificates, property deeds, and the like. If she wanted to fight me on this later, she'd find herself without the paperwork to back her claims. The real revenge, though, came with a plan I'd been building in my head since the moment I read Lawrence's letter. If Jennifer wanted to play the role of a star in Lawrence's life, then I'd make sure the spotlight was shining directly on her. The first step was finding Lawrence. I went to Thomas at the mill again, this time armed with the letter. "Robert," he said when he saw me, "you look like you've been through hell." "Not hell," I replied grimly. "But I'm on my way to delivering it." I handed him the letter. His eyes scanned it quickly, and when he was done, he let out a low whistle. "This is bad," he muttered. "I need to find this Lawrence," I said. "Do you know anyone who might have information on where his troop is?" Thomas rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "There's a merchant in town, Edwin. He handles messages for travelers. If Lawrence left word about his troop's plans, Edwin would know." I didn't waste any time. I headed straight to the merchant's shop, clutching the letter tightly in my pocket. Edwin was a wiry man with quick eyes and a permanent air of suspicion. He looked me up and down as I approached his counter. "Looking for something specific, Robert?" he asked, his tone cautious. "I need information," I said, pulling out a few coins and setting them on the counter. "About a traveling actor named Lawrence." Edwin's eyes flicked to the coins, then back to me. He leaned in closer. "Why the interest?" "That's none of your concern," I said firmly. "Do you know where he is or not?" Edwin hesitated, then nodded. "He left a few days ago, headed north with his troop. Last I heard, they were setting up in Wyndham." I pushed the coins toward him. "Thanks." The trip to Wyndham took 2 days on horseback. The entire journey, I replayed every moment of Jennifer's betrayal in my mind, my resolve hardening with each passing mile. When I arrived, the town was bustling with activity. The traveling troupe had indeed set up shop, their brightly colored tents standing out against the dull browns of the marketplace. It didn't take long to find Lawrence. He was exactly as Thomas had described, a young, handsome, and dripping with the kind of arrogance that made my blood boil. He was performing some sort of skit in the center of the marketplace, drawing laughter and applause from the crowd. I waited until the performance ended, then approached him as he gathered his props. "Lawrence," I said, my voice low. He turned to me with a practiced smile, but it faltered when he saw the look on my face. "Can I help you?" he asked cautiously. "You can start by explaining why you're sending love letters to my wife," I said, pulling the letter from my pocket and shoving it into his chest. His face went pale as he read the words. I didn't know she was married." "Don't lie to me," I growled. "You knew exactly what you were doing." Lawrence stammered, his confident demeanor crumbling under my glare. "It wasn't serious. Just words. That's all." "Words?" I repeated. "You think that makes it better?" "Let me make one thing clear, if you ever so much as think about my wife again, I'll make sure you regret it." He nodded quickly, his hands trembling as he stuffed the letter into his bag. I didn't stay to hear his excuses. I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving him to deal with the shame and fear I'd planted in him. When I returned home, Jennifer was waiting for me, her eyes red from crying. "Where were you?" she asked as soon as I stepped inside. "I took care of something," I said coldly. "Robert, please," she said, stepping closer. "We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." I looked at her, the woman I'd once loved more than anything in the world, and felt nothing but emptiness. "You want to fix this?" I said. "Then start by packing your things." Her face crumpled, But I didn't waver. I'd given her everything, and she'd thrown it away for a man who only dealt in fantasies. She didn't deserve my forgiveness. Jennifer didn't say another word. She turned and walked away, her shoulders slumped in defeat. When the confrontation with Lawrence was behind me, and my resolve to sever any illusions of reconciliation with Jennifer had solidified, I faced a practical dilemma. She had nowhere to go. We weren't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, and Jennifer didn't have family nearby who could take her in. To send her away would mean throwing her into the streets, and while I no longer felt love for her, I wasn't cruel enough to abandon her completely. The solution presented itself the next morning when I went to fetch a tool from the storage shed behind the barn. It was a modest structure, little more than a single room with shelves packed with farming equipment and spare tools. But it was sturdy, clean enough, and most importantly, separate from the main house. With the weather warm and summer ahead, it would suffice. She wouldn't have the comfort of our home anymore, but she also wouldn't be left to fend for herself completely. When I returned to the house, Jennifer was sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes red and puffy. She looked up at me with a mixture of fear and hope, as if she thought there might still be a chance to fix things. "Pack your things," I said, my tone devoid of emotion. "Robert, please," she started, but I held up a hand to cut her off. "You're not leaving the property," I said. "But I'm moving you out of the house. There's a shed behind the barn. It'll be yours from now on." Her jaw dropped. "The shed? Robert, you can't." "I can," I interrupted. "And I am. You want to stay under my roof? Fine. But it won't be this roof. You've already taken enough from me. I'm not letting you stay here, pretending everything's fine." Tears welled up in her eyes again, but I didn't flinch. She'd cried so many times in the last week that I'd grown numb to it. "Get your things," I said again. "And don't take your time." Jennifer moved that afternoon. I carried her smaller belongings to the shed myself, dumping them unceremoniously on the wooden floor. Clothes, toiletries, and a few personal items, enough for her to manage. I left the larger items, like her wardrobe and vanity, in the house. She didn't need luxuries anymore, and I wasn't about to go out of my way to make her comfortable. When I finished, I stood in the doorway, looking at the makeshift room I'd created. I'd moved a cot from the barn into the corner, along with a small table and chair. There was no cooking area, but she could eat what I left in the kitchen. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jennifer stood behind me, clutching her last bundle of clothes. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled as she looked past me into the shed. "You can't mean this," she whispered. I turned to her, my expression cold. "You made your choice when you decided to let another man into your life. Now, you'll live with the consequences. Be grateful I didn't throw you out altogether." She didn't respond. With a resigned sigh, she stepped inside and set her things on the cot. "I'll leave you to settle in," I said, turning to leave. "Robert," she called after me, her voice trembling. I paused but didn't turn around. "Is this forever?" I stood there for a moment, my back to her. "That's up to you," I said finally, then walked away. Life changed drastically in the days that followed. Jennifer was no longer a presence in the main house. I saw her in passing as she tended to her chores or fetched water from the well, but I avoided her whenever possible. She was no longer my wife in any meaningful sense of the word. She was just there. For her part, Jennifer tried to make amends in small ways. She left extra food in the kitchen after cooking, swept the porch without being asked, and once even repaired a torn curtain in the sitting room. But none of it mattered to me. The damage was done, and no amount of sweeping or stitching could fix what she'd broken. The children noticed her absence immediately. Our eldest, Amelia, was the first to ask. "Where's Mama?" she said, looking around the kitchen as I prepared breakfast one morning. "She's staying in the shed for now," I replied without elaborating. "Why?" Amelia pressed, her brow furrowing. "Because that's where she belongs," I said curtly. Amelia opened her mouth to argue but closed it again when she saw the look on my face. I hated what this was doing to them, but I didn't see any other way. They deserved the truth, but they weren't old enough to understand it yet. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat alone on the porch, sipping a cup of tea. Jennifer approached cautiously, her steps hesitant. She stopped a few feet away, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "What do you want?" I asked without looking at her. "I need to talk to you," she said softly. "About what?" She hesitated. "About us. About what happens next." I set my cup down and leaned back in my chair, finally meeting her gaze. "There is no us, Jennifer. Not anymore." "You made sure of that?" Her eyes filled with tears again, but she didn't cry. Instead, she took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. "I made a mistake," she said. "I know that. And I know I can't undo it. But I want to make things right, Robert. I'll do whatever it takes." I let out a bitter laugh. "Whatever it takes? You think a few good intentions are enough to fix this? To fix me? You betrayed me, Jennifer. You made me question everything we've built together. You think a few words are going to change that?" She looked down at her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know. But I have to try." "Well, try all you want," I said coldly. "But don't expect forgiveness. Not now, not ever." Jennifer nodded slowly, as if she'd expected that answer. Without another word, she turned and walked back to the shed, her figure fading into the shadows as night fell. As the days turned into weeks, our arrangements settled into a tense rhythm. Jennifer stayed in the shed, coming to the house only when necessary. I kept my distance, focusing on the farm and the children. As the summer days grew shorter, a chill began to creep into the mornings. By the time August rolled into September, the leaves at the edges of the farm started showing the first hints of orange and yellow. Autumn was approaching, and with it came the inevitable realization I couldn't leave Jennifer in the shed much longer. The nights were growing cooler, and while the shed was sturdy enough to withstand the summer heat, it offered little protection against the coming cold. There was no insulation, no proper heating, just bare wooden walls and a cot. Practicality aside, I knew what my decision would mean for the children. They didn't know the full truth, but they could sense the tension, and it was affecting them. And then there was the truth I didn't want to admit, not even to myself: I still loved her. The realization came slowly. At first, I tried to convince myself it was pity, a sense of obligation after all our years together. But it wasn't that simple. Every time I caught a glimpse of her walking toward the well or saw her silhouette in the dim light of the kitchen window, something stirred in me, an echo of the feelings I'd once had, feelings I thought her betrayal had destroyed. I hated her for what she'd done, but I hated myself even more for not being able to let her go entirely. One particularly crisp morning, I stood by the barn, gazing out over the fields, and made my decision. It was time to take the first step. That evening, as the children were finishing their supper, I lingered near the shed, watching the thin plume of smoke rising from the small fire pit Jennifer had set up outside. She was sitting on a stool, her shoulders wrapped in a shawl, staring into the flames. For a moment, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to turn back, to leave things as they were. But I couldn't. Not anymore. I stepped closer, clearing my throat to announce my presence. Jennifer looked up, startled. Her expression shifted from surprise to wariness, as if she wasn't sure what to expect. "Can we talk?" I asked. She nodded silently, motioning for me to sit on the bench she'd pulled from the shed. We sat there in awkward silence for a while, the crackling of the fire the only sound between us. Finally, I spoke. "Winter's coming," I said. "You can't stay out here when it gets cold." Jennifer glanced at me, her eyes guarded. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you can come back into the house," I replied. "But if this is going to work, we need to figure things out." She didn't answer right away, her hands clutching the edge of her shawl. I don't want to make things harder for you, Robert. I know I've hurt you. I know I've destroyed your trust. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this." Her voice broke on the last word, and she looked down, her tears catching the light of the fire. I don't know if it can be fixed, I admitted, my own voice quieter than I intended. But I'm willing to try. For the children's sake, and because I think a part of me still wants to believe in us. The next morning, Jennifer moved back into the house. I'd expected it to feel like an invasion, like letting a stranger back into my space, but it wasn't as jarring as I'd feared. She was cautious, almost timid, as if afraid to disrupt the fragile truce between us. I set boundaries immediately. She moved into the spare bedroom, and we agreed that this arrangement was temporary until we could figure out where we stood. There were no grand gestures, no sweeping promises of forgiveness. Just a tentative first step towards something that might resemble healing. The children were thrilled. We didn't talk much at first. Our conversations were limited to practical matters, chores, meals, the children. But as the days turned into weeks, the silence began to ease. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, I found Jennifer sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in her hands. She looked up as I entered, her expression cautious but hopeful. "Do you want some tea?" she asked. I hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Sure." She poured me a cup, and we sat across from each other in silence. Finally, Jennifer spoke. "I want to tell you everything," she said softly. "About Lawrence, about what I was feeling, about why I let it happen." I took a sip of tea, watching her carefully. "Go on." She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her cup. "When the festival came, I was already feeling distant. From you, from myself. I felt like I'd lost who I was. And then Lawrence showed up, and he noticed me. He made me feel alive again." Her voice cracked, and she looked down at the table. "I know that doesn't excuse what I did. I should have talked to you, should have told you how I was feeling. But instead, I let myself believe the attention he gave me meant something." "It didn't," I said flatly. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know that now. I've thought about it every day since. I don't want him, Robert. I never did. I just wanted to feel like I mattered." I leaned back in my chair, her words sinking in. "And now? What do you want now?" She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "I want to fix this. I want to earn your trust back. I want to be the wife you deserve." It wasn't an easy conversation, and it didn't end with a neat resolution. But it was a start. Over the weeks that followed, Jennifer made good on her promise to try. She threw herself into the farm work, taking on extra chores without complaint. She spent more time with the children, helping with schoolwork. I watched her carefully, waiting for any sign that her efforts were insincere. But she never faltered. One crisp October morning, as we stood together in the barn stacking hay bales, I broke the silence. "I don't know if I'll ever trust you the way I did before," I said. Jennifer paused, setting down the bale she was holding. "I understand. But I'm willing to try," I continued. "For the kids, and for us. Because I think there's still something worth saving." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time, they weren't tears of sorrow. She nodded, her voice trembling as she said, "Thank you, Robert. I won't let you down." It would be a long road to forgiveness, and I knew there were no guarantees. But for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other.